Welcome back to the Yawning Yeti, where bedtime comes easy and the mountains are always sleepy. Grab your blanket, get comfy, and let's drift off together. Previously, we began our journey through the ancient lands of Middle-earth, a realm of heroes, kings, and dark powers rising once again. From the peaceful hills of the Shire to the shadows of Mordor, we uncovered the beginnings of a tale that would shape the fate of all. But the story is far from over. In this chapter, alliances are tested, kingdoms awaken, and the darkness spreads further than ever before. This is Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King. We start with a flashback, a memory, a glimpse into the past that occurred long ago, though not as long ago as some of the ancient pasts we might imagine from the First Age or the Second Age, but rather within the Third Age, within what might be considered the living memory of some creatures, particularly hobbits, who live quite long lives by hobbit standards. This particular flashback takes us back approximately 560 years before the present events of our story, before the War of the Ring had begun, before the quest to destroy the One Ring had commenced, before everything that we have witnessed in the previous two films had come to pass. We see two figures, two hobbits to be specific, positioned by the banks of a river, a wide and substantial river with brown flowing water that moves ceaselessly downstream. This is the Anduin, the great river that flows from the distant north all the way to the south, cutting through Middle-earth and passing by many different lands, many different kingdoms, and many different peoples who make their homes along its banks. The river itself is old, ancient even, having flowed since the very shaping of the world in the elder days, since before memory itself began, always flowing, always moving, always remaining essentially the same in its nature, yet always changing in its particulars, in each moment of its endless journey to the sea. It is a particular day, a special day, a birthday in fact. One of the hobbits is celebrating his birthday on this pleasant day by the river. His name is Déagol, which is written in Tolkien's careful way, with an accent mark over the letter E, and pronounced something like Day-a-gol, though pronunciations can vary somewhat depending on who is speaking. Déagol is fishing with his friend, or perhaps his cousin, as relations among hobbits are quite complex and intricate, with everyone seeming to be related to everyone else in some way, some manner, some connection that might run through marriage, through blood relation, or simply through the proximity of living in the same small communities for generation after generation. His friend and fishing companion is named Smeagol, which is also written with an accent mark over the letter E and pronounced roughly as Smeagol, following a similar phonetic pattern and structure to Déagol's name. Both names come from the same culture, the same people, specifically the Store Hobbits, who represent one particular branch of the Hobbit family tree. The Stores are somewhat different from the hobbits of the Shire, whom we have come to know throughout this trilogy, being generally larger in build, broader in the shoulders, and possessing different customs and different ways of living their lives. While Shire hobbits prefer to live in the hills and engage in farming, the Stores traditionally live near rivers and make their living through fishing and other water-related activities, making them water folk rather than earth folk. Anche, distinction that matters in hobbit culture and history. The two hobbits are situated in a small boat, a simple wooden fishing boat, of the type that would be quite common and unremarkable for these river folk, these stores, who make their homes along the waterways. The boat rocks gently upon the surface of the water, moved by the current, moved by the flow, moved by the eternal movement of the river that never ceases its journey downstream. Above them, the sky stretches wide and blue, a clear blue expanse dotted here and there with white clouds, small puffy clouds that drift lazily in the distance. The sun shines down upon the scene with warm light, perhaps the warm light of summer, or possibly spring, though the exact season is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the weather is good, the day is pleasant, and the moment is peaceful, at least for now, at least before everything changes in the most terrible way imaginable. Degol, however, is not currently in the boat with his friend. Instead, he is in the water itself, having either jumped or dived from the boat, perhaps attached by a rope for safety, or perhaps swimming freely on his own. He is diving under the surface, descending below into the brown, murky water of the river, looking for fish, or perhaps for anything interesting he might find on the riverbed, or perhaps simply enjoying the act of swimming and diving itself, as the stores are known to enjoy being in the water, as water folk naturally do, as their very nature and culture inclines them toward aquatic activities and the pleasures of the river that sustains them. But then something happens, something unexpected and terrible and utterly life-changing. Degol is suddenly pulled downward, dragged deeper into the water by something, by some force, by some current, by some thing that lurks in the water or under the water or within the water itself. He struggles against this force, fights desperately to swim upward, tries with all his strength to surface so that he can breathe, so that he can escape, so that he can return to the safety of the boat and his friend. But he finds that he cannot overcome the pull. The force is too strong, too powerful, too compelling, drawing him down whether he wills it or not, whether he fights against it or not, whether he lives or dies in the attempt to resist. He goes down and down and down through the murky brown water, sinking inexorably to the riverbed at the bottom of the Anduin, where thick accumulations of mud lie in heavy layers that have built up over an incomprehensible span of time. The mud is brown and black, thick and yielding and cold to the touch, having accumulated over centuries upon centuries, over millennia of the river's flowing, consisting of sediment that has traveled from far upstream, from the distant mountains, from lands far away, constantly flowing and settling and building up layer by layer, creating the riverbed that forms the foundation of the river, the floor upon which the water moves in its eternal journey to the sea. Degol's hand reaches out desperately through the water and the mud, grasping at anything, searching for something, anything at all that he might grab hold of to pull himself up, to anchor himself against the pull, to resist the force that drags him down into the depths where no air exists and where death waits patiently. His fingers sink into the soft mud, the yielding mud, the cold mud of the riverbed, and there his searching hand touches something that feels entirely different from the mud that surrounds it. He feels something hard, something smooth, something round, something that appears to be made of metal, something that clearly does not belong in the mud, in the river, in this particular place where only natural things should be, where only the products of erosion and sedimentation should exist. He grasps this object firmly with desperate fingers, and pulls it free from its resting place in the mud, from the centuries' worth of mud that have covered it and hidden it from the world, from the ages of burial it has endured at the bottom of the Anduin, waiting for this moment, waiting for this discovery, waiting perhaps for this particular hobbit on this particular day. The object comes loose quite easily, perhaps too easily, as if it had been waiting there all along with a patient malevolence, as if it wanted to be found, wanted to be freed, wanted to be taken up once more by a living hand that could carry it back into the world of light and air and bring it closer to its ultimate purpose, whatever that purpose might be. When Deagol finally manages to surface from the water, gasping desperately for air, breathing hard from his terrifying ordeal beneath the river, he is still clutching the object tightly in his hand, unwilling to release it even in his moment of panic and relief at reaching air again. He examines what he has found and sees that it is a ring, a small ring made of gold, a plain gold ring with no visible markings or decorations upon its smooth surface. Just simple yellow gold that catches the light and shines and gleams, even in the murky water that still clings to it, even having emerged from the darkness and mud of the riverbed where it has lain hidden for so long, gleaming as if it had been polished just moments ago, rather than having spent centuries buried in silt and sediment. Deagol considers this ring his precious find, his wonderful discovery, his birthday present to himself from the river, from fate, from whatever forces or coincidences govern such discoveries and bring such objects into the hands of those who find them. He looks at the ring carefully, studies it closely from every angle, examines every aspect of its simple perfection, and finds it beautiful beyond measure, perfect in its proportions, smooth in its finish, and surprisingly comfortable when he slips it onto his finger, where it fits perfectly, as if the ring had been made specifically for him, specifically for his hand, specifically for this moment, as if destiny itself had decreed that this ring should belong to Deagol and to no one else in all the world. But Smeagol sees everything from his position in the boat, watching his friend surface with something in his hand. He sees the ring, sees the gleam of gold catching the sunlight, sees this precious thing that Deagol has discovered in the river, and something terrible happens in that moment of seeing. Something that will change both of their lives forever and will echo through the centuries that follow. Something changes in Smeagol's eyes at that moment. Something shifts in his face and his expression and his entire being. Something dark, something hungry, something fundamentally wrong either enters him in that instant or perhaps reveals something that was always present within him but had remained dormant until this moment, now revealed by the sight of gold, now released by the presence of the ring, now becoming the dominant force in his mind and heart and will. Smeagol wants the ring with a sudden overwhelming desire that consumes every other thought, every other feeling, every other consideration. He needs it in a way that transcends ordinary wanting or wishing or desiring. He must have it, absolutely must possess it. This ring, this precious thing, this treasure that he can already feel calling to him even though he has not touched it, even though it sits in Deagol's hand and not his own. He tells himself that it should be his birthday present, not Deagol's, constructing a justification, building a rationalization for what he knows he wants to do. Because after all, today is Smeagol's birthday that they are celebrating here by the river, not Deagol's birthday at all. and therefore any present given today, any gift discovered today, any treasure found today should rightfully belong to the birthday celebrant, should belong to Smeagol, should be his by right and custom, and the logic of birthdays. Smeagol asks to see the ring, asks to hold it, asks his friend to share this discovery with him, to let him examine it, to allow him to feel its weight and its smoothness and its perfection. His voice carries a strange tone, a needful tone, a pleading tone that suggests this is far more than idle curiosity or friendly interest or the simple desire to admire a pretty object. Deagol, still catching his breath from his frightening underwater ordeal, still recovering from being pulled down by that mysterious force, shows the ring to Smeagol, holds it up so that his friend can see it clearly in the sunlight, but refuses to hand it over, refuses to let his friend hold it in his own hands, refuses to share this precious thing that he has found through his own effort, at his own risk, during his own near-death experience in the depths of the river. This refusal, though perfectly understandable and perfectly justified and perfectly within Deagol's rights as the finder of the object, proves to be the most terrible mistake he will ever make, for it is also the last mistake he will ever make in his life. Smeagol's desire for the ring, his need for it, his overwhelming compulsion to possess it, overwhelms everything else within him in an instant. It overwhelms friendship that has been built over years of companionship. It overwhelms loyalty that should bind cousins and friends and fishing companions together. It overwhelms every moral principle, every ethical teaching, every social constraint that might have restrained him under normal circumstances, under ordinary conditions, when confronted with ordinary temptations. But this is no ordinary temptation, for the ring itself is no ordinary ring, no simple piece of jewelry, no mere gold band that happens to be pretty and valuable. This ring has a will of its own, a purpose of its own, a power of its own that works on those who see it, who touch it, who desire it, amplifying their worst impulses, feeding their darkest desires, corrupting their hearts and minds and souls with a speed and completeness that is terrifying to witness. The ring calls to Smeagol with a voice that cannot be denied, with a power that cannot be resisted by one such as him, with a corruption that spreads through his heart like poison spreading through water, like darkness spreading through light, like death spreading through life. Smeagol lunges at Deagol with sudden violence, attacking his friend without warning, without hesitation, without mercy. His hands reach for Deagol's throat. His fingers close around his friend's neck, and they struggle together by the water's edge, grappling desperately, fighting over the ring with increasing desperation and fury. Deagol tries to fight back, tries to defend himself, tries to escape from this sudden, inexplicable attack by someone he thought was his friend, someone he trusted, someone he never imagined would hurt him. But Smeagol's need for the ring gives him terrible strength, terrible determination, terrible focus that cannot be deterred or defeated or denied. Smeagol's hands find Deagol's throat and begin to squeeze with relentless pressure, choking the life from his friend, strangling him, killing him slowly and deliberately and remorselessly. Deagol's eyes widen in shock and betrayal and fear as he realizes what is happening, as he understands that his friend is actually killing him, that this is not a game or a fight that will end with reconciliation, that this is murder, cold-blooded murder, for the sake of a simple ring that neither of them truly understands. His struggles grow weaker as the air is cut off from his lungs, as consciousness begins to fade, as death approaches with inexorable certainty. Finally, Deagol falls lifeless to the muddy riverbank, his body going limp, his life extinguishing like a candle flame blown out by a strong wind, like a light going dark, like everything vital and alive and good leaving his body and departing to whatever afterlife awaits hobbits who die before their time. He collapses onto the ground where moments ago he was celebrating a friend's birthday by a beautiful river on a pleasant day, his hand opening in death and releasing the ring that he found only moments ago, the ring that he held for such a brief time, the ring that brought about his doom and ended his life on what should have been a joyful day of fishing and friendship and simple pleasures. Smeagol immediately snatches the ring from Deagol's dead fingers, claiming it, seizing it, making it his own through murder and theft and betrayal of the worst kind imaginable. He clutches it to his chest, holds it tightly in both hands, brings it close to his face to examine it, to admire it, to gloat over his possession of it. His face shows a mixture of emotions that are complex and disturbing and deeply troubling to witness. There is triumph there, the fierce satisfaction of having obtained what he wanted, what he needed, what he was willing to kill for. There is also horror beginning to dawn, the first glimmerings of realization about what he has done, about the friend he has murdered, about the line he has crossed, about the person he has become in this moment of terrible choice. But strongest of all, overwhelming every other emotion, consuming every other consideration, is the sense of possession, the overwhelming feeling that this ring is now his precious, his treasure, his own precious thing that he will never willingly part with, not for anything, not for anyone, not for any reason that could ever be offered or threatened or promised. The ring is his now, bought with blood, bought with murder, bought with the sacrifice of his own soul, and he will keep it forever, guarding it jealously, hiding it protectively, allowing no one else to touch it or see it or take it from him. The scene shifts forward in time, jumping ahead through many years, many decades, many long centuries even, showing us in a rapid sequence the transformation of Smeagol over the long years of his possession of the ring, the terrible changes that the ring works upon him, the corruption that spreads through his body and mind and spirit as he clings to his precious through age after age after age. We see him driven from his community when the murder is discovered, when the truth becomes known, when his people realize what he has done and cannot bear to keep him among them. We see him exiled from his home, rejected by his family, shunned by everyone who once knew him, cast out to wander alone in the wilderness, with only the ring for company, with only his precious to love him, with only his treasure to comfort him in his isolation. We see him wandering alone through empty lands, clutching the ring constantly, speaking to it as if it were alive and could hear him and understand him, calling it his precious, his treasure, his birthday present, in a voice that grows more and more distorted over time, more strained, more corrupted, more inhuman. Already his mind begins to twist the truth of what happened by the river, begins to rewrite history in ways that make him the victim rather than the murderer, begins to construct elaborate justifications and rationalizations that allow him to live with what he has done, that allow him to see himself as wronged rather than as wrong, as the innocent party rather than as the killer who strangled his friend for a piece of gold. He retreats from the sunlight which begins to hurt his eyes, from the open air which begins to feel hostile and dangerous, from the world of living things which begins to seem alien and threatening and unwelcoming. The ring extends his life far beyond the natural span of hobbits, far beyond what any hobbit should endure, far beyond what any mortal creature was meant to experience. It keeps him alive in the most technical sense, preventing his body from aging and dying as it naturally should, preserving his physical form year after year and decade after decade and century after century. But this is not true life, not real living, not the vital existence that should characterize a living being. Rather, it is a kind of undeath, a preservation without vitality, a continuation without purpose or joy or anything that makes life worth living. The ring preserves his body, but corrupts his mind and spirit more deeply with each passing year, each passing decade, each passing century of possession. He eventually finds his way into the mountains, into the misty mountains that divide the western lands from the eastern lands of Middle-earth, into the deep dark places under those mountains, where daylight never penetrates and where silence reigns eternal. He discovers a vast network of caves and tunnels that wind through the roots of the mountains, like veins through a body, like passages through a labyrinth, like the intestines of the earth itself, complex and confusing and utterly lightless. There, in the darkness, in the deep places, in the utter absence of light and warmth and companionship and anything good or wholesome or life-giving, Smeagol completes his transformation into something else entirely, something no longer quite hobbit, something twisted and changed and corrupted beyond recognition by the ring's malevolent influence and by centuries of isolation and darkness and obsession. He becomes Gollum, a name that derives from the horrible golluming, gulping sound that he makes constantly in his throat, a wet coughing, hacking sound that becomes his most characteristic noise, his signature, his identifying feature, the sound by which others who hear him in the darkness will come to know him and fear him. His body undergoes terrible changes along with his mind and soul. He grows thin and emaciated and skeletal, all skin stretched over bone and sinew, with no fat remaining anywhere on his frame, no healthy flesh, no substance, just the minimum necessary to keep his essential organs functioning. His eyes grow large and luminous and bulging, adapted through centuries of darkness to seeing in conditions where no light exists, able to perceive his surroundings through some strange sixth sense, or perhaps through detecting the faintest hints of phosphorescence, or perhaps through means that no ordinary creature could understand or replicate. His eyes glow with a pale, sickly light when they catch any illumination, reflecting it back like the eyes of a cat or a wolf, marking him as something other than natural, something changed, something wrong. His skin becomes pale and clammy and cold to the touch, having not seen sunlight or felt its warmth for centuries upon centuries, taking on a greyish, fish-like quality that makes him look like something that has lived too long underwater or in caves, something that has lost all connection to the surface world and to natural daylight and to everything healthy and normal. His teeth grow sharper and more pronounced, changing shape to become better suited for eating the raw fish and other cave-dwelling creatures he catches in the underground lakes and streams, tearing flesh from bone with terrible efficiency, grinding and chewing with sounds that would make any listener's stomach turn. His hair falls out almost entirely, leaving only a few straggly strands here and there clinging to his scalp, making his head look diseased or rotting or simply ancient beyond any normal measure of age. His hands and feet remain relatively large and strong, disproportionately so compared to his shrunken frame, capable of climbing on sheer rock faces and clinging to stone surfaces with incredible strength and endurance. His fingers and toes finding the smallest cracks and projections to support his weight as he scrambles through his underground domain with unnatural agility. But his fingers become long and grasping and spider-like, always clutching at things, always reaching for his precious, always moving in restless, constant motion, even when the rest of his body is still. He lives in these caves for nearly 500 years, alone with his precious ring, alone with his fractured mind, alone with the madness that the ring has worked upon him through the centuries of possession. The ring becomes the absolute center of his entire existence, the only thing he loves, the only thing he values, the only thing that has any meaning or importance or reality in his long, miserable, corrupted life. He catches fish and other creatures in the dark underground lake, eating them raw and whole without cooking or preparing them in any civilized way, making horrible gulping sounds as he swallows them down, speaking to himself constantly in conversations between two aspects of his fractured personality. One part of him still retains some fading memory of being Smeagol, of being a hobbit once, of living in the daylight once, of having friends once, though these memories grow dimmer and more confused with each passing year. The other part is fully consumed by being Gollum, by the corruption, by the obsession with the ring, by nothing but the need to possess and protect and worship the precious above all other considerations. These two sides of his personality, these two voices in his head, argue endlessly with each other about the ring, about what to do, about what they want, about what they need, creating a disturbing dialogue where Gollum literally holds conversations with himself, answering himself, disagreeing with himself, representing the complete fracturing of his mind under the ring's influence and the isolation and the centuries of darkness. But then, after nearly 5 centuries of this existence, something happens that disrupts this long equilibrium of isolation and madness and obsession. A hobbit comes into his caves, a hobbit traveling through the mountain tunnels, fleeing from a band of orcs who are pursuing him through the darkness. This is Bilbo Baggins of the Shire, a respectable hobbit of comfortable means who has been swept up into an adventure he never wanted and never asked for, now finding himself lost in the goblin tunnels under the misty mountains, separated from his companions, alone in the dark, trying to find his way to safety, or at least to find his friends again. Bilbo, while feeling his way through the darkness of the tunnels, with his hands extended before him to avoid walking into walls or falling into pits, accidentally places his hand on something small and smooth and round that is lying on the ground in the passage. He picks this object up without really looking at it carefully in the darkness, without examining it closely, without having any idea what it might be or where it came from. He slips it into his pocket almost automatically, almost without thinking about it, the way one might pocket any small object found lying on the ground, planning perhaps to examine it later when there is light to see by, having no conception whatsoever of the significance of this simple action, having no idea what he has found, having no understanding that he has just picked up the One Ring, the most powerful and dangerous object in all of Middle-earth, an object that great powers have sought for centuries, an object that can unmake the world. What Bilbo does not know, what he cannot know in that moment of discovery, is that Gollum has lost the ring, has lost his precious, has somehow dropped it in the tunnels through carelessness or accident, or perhaps through the ring's own will. For the ring has a will of its own and makes its own choices about who should possess it and when it should leave them. Gollum has not yet realized that the ring is missing, has not yet discovered that his precious has left him, that he is now separated from the one thing that has defined his entire existence for the past 5 centuries. The one thing he values more than life itself, more than breath itself, more than anything and everything in all of creation. When Gollum finally does discover that his precious is missing, when he checks for it and cannot find it, when the horrible truth finally penetrates his consciousness that the ring is gone and he does not know where it is or how to find it, his anguish is complete and total and absolute. He searches frantically through the caves, through every tunnel, through every chamber, through every crack and crevice and corner, growing more desperate, more panicked, more horrified with each passing moment that he cannot find his precious, cannot locate his treasure, cannot reunite himself with the ring that has been his constant companion, his only friend, his reason for existence through all these long centuries of isolation and darkness. He wails and cries and screams in the darkness, the sound of his distress echoing through the stone passages, a sound of pure loss, of absolute despair, of unbearable separation, a sound that would move even hardened hearts to pity if anyone were there to hear it. Though, in fact, there is no one except Bilbo, somewhere in the tunnels. And Bilbo is too far away to hear and too concerned with his own survival to worry about strange sounds in the darkness, even if he did hear them. Gollum's grief is complete and total. The grief of losing the one thing that matters, the one thing that makes existence bearable, the one thing that gives any meaning or purpose to his long, corrupted, miserable life. He eventually encounters Bilbo in the tunnels, though neither initially realizes the connection between them. Neither understands that one possesses what the other has lost. Neither knows that destiny has brought them together in this dark place for purposes that neither can comprehend. They engage in the famous riddle game, a contest of wits that has ancient precedent in Hobbit culture and in many other cultures throughout Middle-earth, where each participant poses riddles to the other, and the first to fail to answer correctly loses the game and must grant whatever request the winner makes. Gollum, in his distress and confusion over losing his precious, in his distracted and desperate state of mind, agrees to this game without thinking clearly, without fully considering the implications, without understanding that he is not in the right mental state to be making agreements or competing in contests of any kind. His mind is wholly consumed by thoughts of his missing precious, by the desperate need to find it, by the overwhelming anxiety of separation. And these preoccupations make it nearly impossible for him to concentrate properly on the riddles being posed, nearly impossible to think clearly enough to answer them correctly, nearly impossible to function at all in any normal capacity. Bilbo, through a combination of genuine cleverness, good fortune, and possibly some unconscious influence of the ring itself, which may want to escape from Gollum and find a new bearer, manages to match Gollum riddle for riddle through several rounds of their contest. Finally, in a moment of desperation when he cannot think of a proper riddle to pose, Bilbo asks a question that is not truly a riddle at all by the traditional rules and definitions of the riddle game. He asks, "What have I got in my pocket?" This is not a fair riddle, not a proper riddle, not a riddle that can be solved through knowledge or wit or cleverness or any of the mental faculties that riddle games are meant to test. Instead, it is a question that requires Gollum to somehow guess what specific object Bilbo happens to be carrying in his pocket at this particular moment, which is fundamentally impossible unless one happens to know the answer through having seen the object or through some other means of direct knowledge. Gollum protests vigorously that this is not a proper riddle, that this is not fair, that the ancient rules and traditions of riddle games are being violated, that he should not have to answer such a question. But Bilbo insists that a riddle is a riddle, and that Gollum must either answer it or admit defeat. Gollum is given 3 guesses, 3 attempts to answer this impossible question, and he tries desperately to think of what Bilbo might have in his pocket. He guesses various things that hobbits typically carry, various ordinary objects that one might reasonably expect to find in a hobbit's pocket. But none of his guesses are correct. None of them are anywhere close to the truth. For how could he possibly guess that what Bilbo has in his pocket is Gollum's own precious ring, the ring that Gollum has been desperately searching for, the ring that Bilbo found lying in the tunnel and picked up without knowing what it was? After Gollum's 3rd incorrect guess, he must admit defeat in the riddle game according to the rules and traditions that both of them have agreed to follow. But instead of graciously accepting his loss and granting Bilbo's request as honor and custom demand, Gollum suddenly realizes with horrifying clarity what must have happened, suddenly understands what Bilbo must have in his pocket, suddenly knows with absolute certainty that this hobbit, this intruder, this thief has his precious, has found it, has taken it, has stolen it from him. The realization drives him into a frenzy of rage and desperation beyond anything he has experienced even in the moment when he first discovered the ring was missing. Gollum forgets all about the riddle game, forgets all about rules and agreements and honor and custom, consumed entirely by the need to recover his precious, to take it back from this thief, to murder this hobbit if necessary, to do whatever must be done to reunite himself with the ring that is his, that has always been his, that belongs to him and to no one else in all the world. He attacks Bilbo with murderous intent, scrambling through the darkness with incredible speed, following Bilbo's scent and the sound of his movements, hunting him through the tunnels with single-minded determination to kill him and take back the ring. But Bilbo, in his panic and desperation to escape from this suddenly hostile creature, this monster that is trying to kill him, accidentally slips the ring onto his finger in the darkness. The ring, as is its nature and its power, immediately makes Bilbo invisible, completely unseen by Gollum, or by anyone else who might look at him, rendering him effectively undetectable by normal vision. This property of the ring, this ability to make its bearer invisible, is actually only a side effect of its true power, which is far greater and far more terrible. But for Bilbo in this moment, invisibility is exactly what he needs, exactly what saves his life, exactly what allows him to escape from Gollum's murderous pursuit. Gollum cannot see Bilbo anymore, cannot find him in the darkness, cannot locate him to attack him and kill him and take back the precious ring. Bilbo, still invisible, manages to follow Gollum through the tunnels, letting Gollum unknowingly lead him toward the exit, toward the way out of the goblin caves, toward freedom and safety and the surface world. At the last moment, as they approach the exit where daylight filters into the cave mouth, Bilbo must make a terrible choice, a choice that will define much of what follows, a choice that speaks to his character and his nature and his fundamental goodness. He could kill Gollum. He has his sword drawn. He is invisible. Gollum is unaware of his presence. And one quick thrust would end Gollum's miserable life and remove any threat of future pursuit. Bilbo even raises his sword, even prepares to strike, even considers the practical advantages of killing this dangerous creature that has tried to murder him and will surely try again if given the chance. But at the last moment, Bilbo is stayed by pity, by compassion, by the recognition that Gollum is himself a pitiable creature, a victim of circumstances and of the ring's corruption, someone to be pitied rather than hated, to be mourned rather than destroyed. This moment of mercy, this choice not to kill when killing would have been easy and perhaps justified, proves to be one of the most important decisions in the entire history of Middle-earth. Though Bilbo has no way of knowing this at the time, though he acts purely from his own innate goodness, without any understanding of the larger implications, he spares Gollum's life, leaps over him instead of striking him down, and escapes into the daylight, carrying with him the ring that will eventually bring him home safely from his adventure, that will remain in his possession for many years, and that will eventually pass to his nephew Frodo, leading to all the events that we have witnessed in the previous films, and that will conclude in this final chapter of the story. But all of this is backstory, is prologue, is the foundation that explains how the ring came into the possession of Bilbo and eventually Frodo, how Gollum lost it and has been searching for it ever since, how their destinies became intertwined in the darkness under the misty mountains so many years ago. The flashback ends, the memory fades, and we return to the present time in Middle-earth, to the time of the War of the Ring, to the moment when everything hangs in the balance, when the fate of all free peoples depends upon the success or failure of a quest to destroy this very ring that we have just seen being discovered by Déagol, stolen by Sméagol through murder, possessed by Gollum for centuries, lost in the tunnels, found by Bilbo, and eventually inherited by Frodo, who now carries it toward its destruction. We return to Frodo Baggins, nephew and adopted heir of Bilbo Baggins, who has inherited not only Bilbo's home and possessions and comfortable life in the Shire, but also this ring, this burden, this curse, this object of evil power that must be destroyed before it can be reclaimed by its creator, the Dark Lord Sauron, who forged it in the fires of Mount Doom long ago, and who has been searching for it ever since it was cut from his finger in battle at the end of the Second Age, Frodo is on a quest to destroy the ring by casting it back into the fires where it was made, into Mount Doom in the land of Mordor, the only place in all of Middle-earth where the ring can be unmade, where its power can be ended, where its evil can be finally and completely eliminated from the world forever. But Frodo does not travel alone on this desperate and dangerous quest. He's accompanied by Samwise Gamgee, his gardener, his servant, his friend, the most loyal and faithful companion that anyone could hope to have in such a terrible journey through enemy lands towards certain doom. Sam has stayed with Frodo through every trial, through every danger, through every moment of despair and hopelessness, never wavering in his commitment, never abandoning his master, even when abandonment would have been the sensible choice, never giving up hope, even when hope seems like the most foolish and naive of all possible attitudes to maintain in the face of overwhelming darkness and evil. And there is a third member of this traveling party, though calling him a companion would be far too generous. Calling him a friend would be laughably inappropriate, and calling him trustworthy would be dangerously naive and foolish. This third member is Gollum himself, the very creature from the flashback, the same Sméagol who murdered Déagol beside the river so long ago, the same Gollum who possessed the ring for 5 centuries in the darkness under the mountains, the same twisted and corrupted and pathetic creature who now serves as a guide for Frodo and Sam, leading them through the dangerous lands around Mordor, showing them secret paths that avoid the main roads and the large concentrations of enemy forces, bringing them closer and closer to their destination and to their doom. Gollum leads them because he must, because Frodo has bound him with oaths and promises made upon the ring itself, because the ring's power compels him even now to serve its bearer in certain ways that he cannot resist, because he hopes desperately that somehow, through some opportunity that will present itself, he will eventually be able to reclaim his precious, to take it back from the hobbit who now carries it, to once again possess the treasure that he loves above all things, above his own life, above any other consideration in all of creation. But Gollum is deeply divided within himself, torn between 2 distinct personalities, 2 conflicting voices, 2 completely opposite desires that war constantly within his fractured mind. Part of him, the part that still remembers being Sméagol, even after all these centuries of corruption and transformation, feels something that might almost be called affection for Frodo, something that recognizes in Frodo a kindness and a gentleness that Gollum has not experienced in so long that he can barely remember what such treatment feels like. This Sméagol part responds to Frodo's consistent policy of treating him with a measure of respect and consideration, of calling him by his original name rather than by the insulting nickname Gollum, of speaking to him as if he was still a person rather than a monster. And this treatment awakens in Sméagol memories of who he once was, feelings that he thought were long dead, possibilities for redemption that seem utterly impossible, but that Frodo's kindness makes seem almost real, almost achievable, almost worth hoping for. But the other part of him, the Gollum part, the fully corrupted part, the part that is entirely consumed by desire for the ring and by hatred for those who keep it from him, hates Frodo with passionate and terrible intensity, hates him for possessing the precious ring, hates him for keeping it away from Gollum's grasping fingers, hates him for every moment that passes with the ring around Frodo's neck rather than in Gollum's hand, hates him for existing and for standing between Gollum and the one thing that Gollum loves and desires and needs more than breath or food or life itself. These two sides of Gollum's personality engage in constant conversation with each other, a disturbing and sometimes darkly comic dialogue where Gollum literally argues with himself out loud, debates with himself, disagrees with himself, represents in audible form the complete fracturing and splitting of his personality under centuries of the ring's corrupting influence and the isolation and the obsession that have consumed his entire being. The three of them are walking through a desolate and hostile landscape, through the Emin Muir and the dead marshes and the approaches to Mordor, through terrain that becomes increasingly barren and lifeless and threatening with each mile they travel, each step they take toward their destination. The ground beneath their feet is grey and brown and black, consisting of broken rock, sharp stones that cut through the soles of boots and hobbit feet alike, volcanic ash that rises in choking clouds when disturbed, and poisoned earth where nothing grows, where nothing can grow, where even the hardiest weeds and grasses have given up any attempt at life. The sky above them is not blue and pleasant, but rather a sickly yellowish-grey colour, perpetually overcast, never showing the sun clearly, never allowing the clean light of day to properly illuminate this cursed landscape that surrounds Mordor like a moat of desolation, surrounding a castle of evil. They are climbing constantly, always climbing, making their way through increasingly difficult and treacherous terrain, scrambling over rocks and boulders, navigating through narrow passages between cliff faces, ascending toward the mountains that surround Mordor on three sides, the natural fortress walls of volcanic peaks that protect Sauron's realm from easy invasion and that make any approach difficult and dangerous. The journey is exhausting in every way possible, draining not just their physical strength, but also their mental fortitude and their spiritual reserves, taking every ounce of strength and will and determination that Frodo and Sam possess, pushing them to the absolute limits of their endurance, testing whether hobbits, small creatures from a comfortable land of green fields and good food and peaceful days, can possibly accomplish what needs to be accomplished in this hostile, evil, death-haunted place. Frodo feels the weight of the ring constantly with him, and this is not just its physical weight hanging on the chain around his neck, though that physical weight grows steadily greater the closer they come to Mordor, the closer they come to Sauron, the closer they come to the ring's place of origin. More oppressive than any physical weight is the spiritual weight, the moral weight, the psychological weight of carrying an object of such immense evil power, an object that wants to be found by its master, that wants to return to Sauron, that wants to corrupt and destroy whoever possesses it. The ring whispers to Frodo constantly in ways that are not quite words, but are perhaps more effective than words, speaking directly to his unconscious mind, to his deepest fears and desires, planting impulses and temptations that grow stronger and more insistent with each passing day, each passing mile, each passing step closer to their destination. Sam watches Frodo with growing concern and alarm, noticing how his master grows paler and thinner and weaker with each day that passes, each mile they travel, each hour they spend in this terrible land carrying this terrible burden. Sam tries his best, to encourage Frodo, tries to keep his master's spirits up through kind words and through reminders of home, tries to make him remember the Shire and all its green fields and comfortable hobbit holes, all the good things that exist in the world and are worth fighting for, worth suffering for, worth dying for, if necessary to preserve them from Sauron's conquest and corruption. Sam carries most of their supplies in his pack, meager though these supplies have become after so long on the road, trying to spare Frodo any burden except the one burden that only Frodo can carry, the burden of the ring itself, which grows heavier with every step toward Mordor. Their food supply is running dangerously low, down to small, carefully rationed portions of lembas bread, the elven way bread that was given to them by the Lady Galadriel in Lothlorien. What seems like ages ago now, though in fact it has been only a few months in the regular time of the world. This lembas bread sustains and nourishes beyond what normal food could accomplish, providing strength and endurance that ordinary provisions simply cannot match, magical or blessed in some way that allows them to keep going when ordinary food would have long since proven insufficient to sustain life and strength on such a grueling journey. But even lembas bread runs out eventually. Even this special elvish provision has limits. Even magic cannot create something from nothing. And Sam carefully measures and rations their remaining portions, trying to make them last until they reach Mount Doom, trying to ensure they will have enough strength to complete their journey before they complete their final collapse into death from starvation and exhaustion. Gollum, meanwhile, sustains himself on other things entirely, catching whatever he can find in the occasional pools or streams they pass, eating raw fish and frogs and insects and whatever other living things he can capture, eating them whole and raw in his horrible gulping way, making wet smacking sounds that turn Sam's stomach, showing his sharp teeth as he tears flesh from bone, reminding Sam constantly and viscerally that this creature, this so-called guide, this Smeagol, as Frodo insists on calling him, is dangerous and untrustworthy, and fundamentally not on their side, despite any appearances to the contrary, is waiting for his chance to betray them, to murder them if necessary, to reclaim his precious by any means available, just as he murdered Déagol so long ago beside that river, in a time that seems impossibly distant now, impossibly innocent, impossibly removed from this present nightmare of their journey through the wasteland toward Mordor and Mount Doom. Sam and Gollum maintain an uneasy and frequently hostile truce, circling each other with mutual suspicion and barely concealed dislike, speaking to each other only when absolutely necessary, and then in tones of contempt and mistrust, held together only by Frodo's will and Frodo's insistence that they need Gollum's guidance, that they cannot possibly find their way through these treacherous lands without someone who knows the paths and the dangers, that Gollum represents their best chance, and perhaps their only realistic chance of finding a way into Mordor that is not guarded by vast armies, by fortified gates, by watchtowers and patrols, and all the military might that Sauron has assembled to protect his borders from any intrusion or invasion. Gollum has promised to show them a secret way into Mordor, a path that he knows from his wanderings in years past, a route that bypasses the Black Gate and the main fortifications where armies stand ready to repel any attack or intrusion, where no small party of hobbits could possibly hope to pass unnoticed or unchallenged. This secret path, Gollum says, leads through the mountains, through a high pass, through a tunnel, through a way that he alone knows, through routes that he discovered long ago in the years after he lost his precious. When he was searching desperately for any trace of the ring, for any hint of where it might have gone, wandering through all the lands between the misty mountains and Mordor searching for his treasure. But Gollum has not told them everything about this path, has not been completely honest about what awaits them on this route, has not mentioned the dangers that lurk in the tunnel that they must pass through. Gollum is planning something, plotting something, scheming something in that twisted, corrupted mind of his, though Frodo and Sam do not yet know the full extent of his treachery, though they suspect that something is wrong, though Sam especially distrusts Gollum completely and wishes fervently that they had never agreed to let this creature guide them anywhere, wishes they had found some other way, some safer way, even though rationally he knows that there probably is no other way, no safer path, no better option available to them. While Frodo and Sam and Gollum make their slow and agonizing way toward Mordor through the wasteland, other events are unfolding simultaneously in other parts of Middle-earth. Other threads of this great tapestry of story are being woven forward. Other characters are playing their roles in the vast drama that will ultimately determine the fate of all the free peoples of the world. The narrative shifts now to show us these other events, these parallel storylines, these simultaneous occurrences that are all connected to the same great struggle, all part of the same war against Sauron and the darkness he represents, all contributing in different ways to the ultimate outcome of this conflict that will decide whether light or darkness triumphs, whether freedom or slavery prevails, whether life or death rules the world in the age to come. We see Gandalf the White, returned miraculously from death beyond the circles of the world, transformed and empowered and elevated to become the chief of the wizards and the leader of the resistance against Sauron's forces. Gandalf rides his magnificent horse, Shadowfax, the lord of all horses, the greatest and swiftest steed in all of Middle-earth, a horse that can understand speech and that serves Gandalf willingly, rather than through any compulsion or training. Sitting behind Gandalf on Shadowfax, clinging desperately to the wizard's white robes and looking small and worried and very much out of place in the midst of all these great and terrible events, is Pippin, one of the hobbits of the Fellowship Peregrine took of the Shire, who has become inadvertently entangled in events far larger and more dangerous than anything a hobbit should ever have to face. They are riding toward Minas Tirith, the great city of Gondor, the last major stronghold of men in the continuing fight against Sauron's ever-expanding dominion, the White City that is built directly against and partially into a mountain, rising in 7 distinct tiers or levels, each level surrounded by its own wall, each level more elevated than the one below, creating a pyramidal structure that is both beautiful to behold from a distance and incredibly defensible against any attacking force. At the very top of these 7 levels stands the citadel of Gondor, and within the citadel rises the White Tower, where the steward of Gondor rules in the absence of the king. For Gondor has had no king for many generations, for many centuries, ruling itself through a succession of stewards who govern in the king's name, maintaining his throne, preserving his authority, waiting theoretically for the king's return, though most people have long since given up any real hope, that such a return will ever actually occur. Pippin is riding with Gandalf toward Minas Tirith because of events that transpired at Isengard after the defeat of Saruman, because of Pippin's discovery of the Palantir, one of the 7 seeing stones that were made by the elves in ancient times, devices of great power that allow those who possess them and know how to use them to see across vast distances, to communicate with others who possess similar stones, to perceive events occurring far away, to know things that would otherwise remain hidden or unknown. Pippin, in a moment of weakness and curiosity that he will regret for the rest of his life, foolishly looked into the Palantir despite being warned not to touch it, unable to resist the temptation to peer into its depths, activating the stone and bringing his consciousness into direct contact with Sauron himself, with the Dark Lord who possesses another Palantir in Barad-dûr, and who was using it at that very moment to search for the ring-bearer, to hunt for the hobbit who carries the One Ring, to locate and destroy the quest before it can succeed in reaching Mount Doom. Sauron saw Pippin in the Palantir, saw a hobbit staring back at him through the Seeing Stone, and naturally assumed that this must be the ring-bearer, that Saruman at Isengard must have succeeded in capturing Frodo and the ring, that his servant had accomplished what he was supposed to accomplish. Gandalf, recognizing both the terrible danger and the potential opportunity in this development, in this case of mistaken identity, decided immediately to use Pippin's mistake to their advantage, to encourage Sauron's false belief that the ring is going to Minas Tirith, to the city of Gondor, rather than to Mordor, where Frodo is actually carrying it, thereby buying precious time, creating a crucial diversion, misdirecting Sauron's attention and his military forces away from the real threat, away from the actual path of the quest, away from Frodo and Sam struggling through the wasteland toward Mount Doom and the destruction of the ring. They approach Minas Tirith across the great plain of the Pelennor Fields, vast acres of farmland that stretch before the city, cultivated fields that provide food for the city's large population, fields of grain and vegetables that should be green and growing, but that now lie fallow and abandoned as the farmers have fled to the safety of the city walls, in anticipation of the war that everyone knows is coming. These fields will soon become a battlefield, a killing ground, a place of death and destruction when Sauron's armies arrive and lay siege to the city, when the war truly begins in earnest, when blood soaks the earth and turns these peaceful farmlands into a scene of slaughter and horror that will be remembered for all the ages to come. The city rises before them as they approach, its white stone walls gleaming brilliantly in the sunlight, beautiful and strong and ancient, built by hands long dead, using techniques and skills that have been lost to the current age, built by a civilization that was once far greater than it is now, that has been slowly declining through all the long centuries of the Third Age, slowly fading and diminishing as all the great works and great peoples of the elder days fade and diminish, making way gradually for a new age, perhaps a lesser age in terms of glory and magic and wonder, but an age of men nonetheless, an age of mortals who will inherit Middle-earth and rule it in their own way after the elves and the wizards and all the ancient powers have departed forever across the sea to the undying lands. The city is built with its back directly against the living rock of the mountain, with the mountain itself forming the rear wall of the city, making it utterly impossible to attack from behind, focusing all defensive considerations on the front, on the Great Gate, on the walls that face outward toward the Pelennor fields and toward any enemy that might approach across those fields. Each level of the city is set back slightly from the level immediately below it, creating the stepped or pyramidal appearance that makes the city visible for many miles across the plain, with roads winding back and forth up the face of the city, switching back and forth like a serpent climbing a tree, ascending through gates in each level's wall, making any invasion or assault incredibly difficult and costly, requiring attackers to breach not just one wall, but 7 successive walls, to fight their way up through increasingly narrow and easily defensible passages, all while under constant attack from above, from the levels they have not yet conquered, from defenders who hold the high ground and can rain down arrows and stones and burning oil on anyone attempting to force their way upward. At the very top of the city, at the 7th and highest level, stands the citadel of Gondor, the seat of power, the center of government, and rising from within the citadel is the White Tower of Ithilien, named for a previous steward, where the current steward of Gondor resides and from which he rules over all the lands that still acknowledge Gondor's authority and resist Sauron's conquest. Before the citadel should stand the White Tree of Gondor, the symbol of the city and the kingdom, a descendant of ancient and sacred trees that trace their lineage back to the undying lands themselves. But this tree has been dead for many years now, standing bare and grey and lifeless in the courtyard, its branches naked of leaves, its trunk dry and cracked. Another potent symbol of Gondor's decline, another marker of the fading glory of this once great kingdom, another sign that the great days are in the past and that the future is uncertain at best, dark and despairing, and doomed at worst. Gandalf and Pippin ride through the great gate of the city, entering Minas Tirith, beginning their climb through level after level after level, observed by the citizens of the city who line the streets and gaze at them with expressions of worry and fear and desperate hope. These people know that war is coming, that Sauron's armies are gathering, that their city will soon be under siege, under assault, fighting literally for its survival and for the survival of everyone within its walls. The people look gaunt and hungry and afraid, knowing what approaches, powerless individually to prevent it, able only to wait and hope that their walls will hold against the coming storm, that their defenders will prove strong enough and brave enough and numerous enough, that somehow, through some miracle or some unexpected fortune, they will endure and survive what is about to befall them in the days ahead. They reach the top level and enter the citadel, making their way to the great hall where Denethor sits in judgment and rules over Gondor as its steward. Denethor should be noble and wise and inspiring, should be a leader who rallies his people and gives them hope and courage in this desperate hour. But instead, he has become bitter and despairing and increasingly mad, slowly losing his grip on sanity, slowly surrendering to hopelessness and defeatism, slowly becoming an obstacle and a liability rather than a leader and an asset in the desperate fight to save his city and his people from annihilation. Denethor is not ancient, but is certainly old, perhaps in his 70s, with long white hair and a grey beard and a face that shows both intelligence and cruelty, both strength and weakness, both pride and despair, warring constantly within him. for dominance. His madness has many causes, many different roots and sources that intertwine and reinforce each other in his damaged and deteriorating mind. He has lost his wife, who died many years ago, a loss he has never recovered from, never properly accepted, never adequately mourned, carrying the pain of her absence like an open wound that refuses to heal, like a knife that remains perpetually lodged in his heart, turning everything bitter, poisoning everything good, making joy and hope seem like distant memories from another lifetime. He has two sons, Boromir and Faramir, and the dynamics of his relationship with these two sons form another major source of his psychological disturbance and his gradual descent into madness. He loved Boromir, his eldest son, his favorite, his chosen heir, the strong warrior, the hero of Gondor, the son who embodied everything Denethor valued and wanted and hoped for in a successor. But Boromir is dead now, though Denethor does not yet know this with certainty, fallen in battle far from home while defending Merry and Pippin from the Uruk-hai, dying heroically but uselessly in a doomed attempt to protect hobbits he barely knew, dying without his father's knowledge or blessing or presence, dying alone in a distant land with only Aragorn to witness his passing and to honor his sacrifice. Denethor does not yet know with absolute certainty that Boromir is dead, but he suspects it deeply, fears it constantly, feels it in his heart and in his bones, and this uncertainty, this dreadful suspense, this inability to know for sure whether his beloved son lives or has perished, drives him steadily toward complete despair and madness, makes him unable to think clearly or to make rational decisions or to function as the leader his city and his people desperately need him to be. His second son, Faramir, still lives and still serves and still fights valiantly for Gondor, leading men in battle, defending the borders, doing everything a loyal son should do. But Denethor gives Faramir almost no love, almost no approval, almost no recognition or acknowledgement of his worth and his efforts, seeing in Faramir only a pale and inadequate shadow of Boromir, a lesser son, a disappointment, someone who should have been more but is not, someone who should perhaps have died instead of Boromir, though Denethor would never actually say this terrible thought aloud, keeping it buried in the darkest and most shameful corners of his heart, where even he tries not to look at it directly. But perhaps the greatest and most immediate cause of Denethor's advancing madness is his use of a palantir, a seeing stone that Gondor has possessed secretly for many centuries, kept hidden in the White Tower, used by previous stewards, and now by Denethor himself to watch for danger approaching, to observe the movements and preparations of Sauron's forces, to try to gather intelligence and stay informed about the many threats that gather against Gondor from all directions. But using a palantir is extraordinarily dangerous for anyone who is not exceptionally strong-willed and mentally disciplined, requiring great care to avoid being deceived or manipulated, or even dominated outright by Sauron, who possesses the Master Stone in Barad-dûr, and who uses it constantly to project his power across great distances, to spread his influence into the minds of others, to corrupt and destroy and dominate those who dare to challenge him by using the Seeing Stones for their own purposes. Denethor has been using his palantir regularly for years, perhaps for decades, looking into it night after night, trying to gather useful intelligence about enemy movements and preparations, trying to anticipate attacks and prepare appropriate defenses, genuinely believing that he is serving Gondor's interests by maintaining this dangerous vigil. But in the process of using the Seeing Stone, he has been inadvertently showing himself to Sauron, allowing the Dark Lord to see into his mind, to plant seeds of doubt and fear and despair, to undermine his judgment and his confidence, to drive him slowly but inexorably toward the madness that now increasingly grips him. Sauron has not completely dominated Denethor's will, has not turned him into a puppet or a conscious servant of darkness, but has successfully poisoned his mind and his spirit, has filled him with a deep and abiding hopelessness, has convinced him that defeat is inevitable regardless of what anyone does, that resistance against Sauron's overwhelming power is ultimately futile, that all their efforts and sacrifices will come to nothing, that the age of men is ending not with glory, but with extinction, with annihilation, with utter and complete destruction, leaving nothing behind except ashes and ruins and the memory of what once was. Gandalf brings Pippin before Denethor in the great hall of the citadel, presenting the young hobbit as someone who was present when Boromir fell, as a witness to Boromir's final moments, as someone who can testify to Boromir's courage and honor in death, as someone who owes Boromir a debt of gratitude for the protection Boromir provided in his final battle. Pippin, overwhelmed by the setting and the circumstances and the weight of what he must say, offers his service to Denethor in payment of the debt he owes to Boromir, pledging himself to the steward of Gondor in a formal oath that binds him to serve Denethor's commands for as long as Denethor requires his service. Denethor accepts Pippin's oath and service, though his motivations for doing so are complex and not entirely benevolent. He sees in Pippin both a connection to his lost son and a potential source of information about Gandalf's plans and intentions, for Denethor does not entirely trust Gandalf, suspects that the wizard has his own agenda that may not align perfectly with Gondor's immediate interests, resents Gandalf's independence and his refusal to submit to Denethor's authority as other advisors and servants must. By accepting Pippin into his service, Denethor gains both a living reminder of Boromir and a possible spy who might report to him about what Gandalf is planning, what the wizard knows, what strategies and schemes are being developed without Denethor's knowledge or approval. The city prepares for war, for the siege that everyone knows is approaching, for the assault that will soon fall upon Minas Tirith, with all the fury and power that Sauron can muster. Soldiers drill in the courtyards and on the walls, practicing formations and maneuvers, sharpening weapons, repairing armor, preparing themselves mentally and physically for the battle to come. Citizens stockpile food and water within the city, understanding that once the siege begins, they will be cut off from the outside world, unable to receive supplies or reinforcements, dependent entirely on what they have managed to gather and preserve within the walls. The blacksmiths work day and night forging weapons and armor, the sound of their hammers ringing constantly through the streets, the glow of their forges visible even at night like small red stars burning in the darkness. Everyone does what they can to prepare, to contribute, to help ensure that when the storm finally breaks upon them, they will be as ready as possible to face it and to endure it, and hopefully to survive it. But despite all these preparations, despite all this activity and determination and courage, there is an underlying sense of doom, of inevitability, of the approaching end of all things. The people can see the darkness gathering in the east, can see the clouds of smoke and ash rising from Mordor like a black curtain being slowly drawn across the sky, can feel in their bones that something terrible is coming, something worse than any previous war or battle, something that may finally overwhelm even the strength of Minas Tirith's walls and the courage of Gondor's defenders. They prepare because they must, because there is nothing else to do, because giving up and surrendering without a fight would be unthinkable. But many of them harbor secret doubts about whether preparation will be enough, whether courage will be sufficient, whether anything they do will ultimately matter in the face of the vast and terrible power that Sauron has assembled in Mordor and is now preparing to unleash upon them. Meanwhile, in another part of Middle-earth, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the heir of Isildur, the rightful king of Gondor, though he has not yet claimed that title or that throne, travels toward Minas Tirith by a different route, bringing with him Legolas the elf and Gimli the dwarf, the other surviving members of the original fellowship besides the hobbits and Gandalf. But Aragorn does not travel directly to Minas Tirith, despite the urgent need for every able warrior to be present for the defense of the city. Instead, he has chosen to take a different path, a darker path, a more dangerous path that few men would willingly take even in the direst of circumstances. Aragorn has learned through Gandalf's counsel and through his own study of ancient lore that there is another source of aid that might be called upon in Gondor's hour of need, another force that might be mustered to fight against Sauron's armies, though this force is not composed of living men who can be simply commanded or requested to march to war. Aragorn intends to take the paths of the dead, to enter the mountain and walk through the halls where dead men dwell, to find the spirits of those who broke their oath to Gondor's king in ages past, who were cursed for their betrayal to remain in the world as ghosts until they should fulfill the oath they broke, until they should fight for Gondor's king, as they swore to do but failed to do when their service was first required. This is an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking, for the paths of the dead are exactly what their name suggests, a place where the living do not go, a place where only the dead dwell in endless twilight, a place of terror and horror and supernatural dread that would break the mind of any ordinary person who dared to enter. But Aragorn is no ordinary person. He is the heir of Isildur, the descendant of the very king to whom the oath was first sworn, the only person alive who has the right and the authority to hold these oath breakers to their ancient promise, the only one who can command them to fulfill their obligation and thereby win their release from the curse that binds them to the world long after their natural lives should have ended. Legolas and Gimli accompany Aragorn on this quest, despite their own fears and despite their well-justified doubts about the wisdom of entering a place so obviously dangerous and supernatural. They go because they are his friends, because they are oath-bound to the Fellowship and its purposes, because they believe in Aragorn and in his destiny, even when he himself sometimes doubts it, and because they understand that desperate times require desperate measures, that conventional forces and conventional strategies may not be sufficient to defeat Sauron, that something more is needed, something unexpected, something that the enemy will not anticipate or prepare for. They approach the entrance to the paths of the dead which is located in the White Mountains, in a deep valley where the sun rarely shines, where shadows linger even at midday, where the very rocks seem to radiate cold and fear and a sense of wrongness that makes every instinct scream at them to turn back, to flee, to go anywhere else rather than proceeding forward into this accursed place. The entrance is a dark opening in the mountainside, a gaping mouth that seems to swallow light rather than merely being shaded, an opening from which a cold wind blows constantly, carrying with it the smell of death and decay and centuries of accumulated dread. Before they enter, they are met by Eowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan, the niece of King Theoden, a woman of great beauty and greater courage who has followed Aragorn from Rohan because she loves him, though her love is not returned in the way she wishes it to be, though Aragorn's heart belongs to another, to Arwen, the elf maiden far away in Rivendell. Eowyn pleads with Aragorn not to take this path, not to enter the mountain, not to risk himself in this way, partly out of concern for his safety and partly out of her own desperate desire to have him remain where she can see him, where she can perhaps eventually win his love, where she might have some chance of happiness with him rather than watching him disappear into darkness and death. But Aragorn refuses her pleas gently but firmly, explaining that he must take this path, that there is no other way to raise the force needed to turn the tide of the coming battle, that his destiny lies along this dark road regardless of the danger, regardless of the fear, regardless of what personal wishes he or anyone else might have. He tries to console Eowyn, tries to honor her feelings while making clear that he cannot return them, tries to make her understand that he values her courage and her strength, even though he cannot give her his heart. Eowyn is devastated by this rejection, by this confirmation that her love is hopeless, that her hopes are vain, that there is no future for her along the path she had imagined and desired. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli enter the paths of the dead, leaving daylight and life behind, descending into darkness and death and supernatural terror. The path leads downward into the mountain, through chambers carved from living rock, through halls where dead men dwelt in life and where their spirits still linger in a twilight existence between life and true death. The darkness is absolute, broken only by the faint luminescence of the spirits themselves when they begin to appear, manifesting as pale green glowing figures that drift through the halls like mist, like fog, like something not quite solid but not quite insubstantial either, existing in a state that defies normal categories of being and non-being. The spirits are hostile to the living, resentful of those who still possess life while they are trapped in this cursed half-existence, angry at being disturbed, threatening violence and death to any who dare intrude upon their domain. They surround Aragorn and his companions, pressing close, their faces twisted with rage and despair, their voices whispering threats and curses, creating an atmosphere of overwhelming dread and terror that would indeed drive most men mad with fear if they were forced to endure it for more than a few moments. But Aragorn stands firm against them, refusing to show fear, refusing to flee, refusing to be intimidated by these spirits despite the supernatural terror they project. He speaks to them with the authority of a king, with the voice of the heir of Isildur, reminding them of their broken oath, of their ancient promise to fight for Gondor's king, of the curse that binds them to the world until they fulfill that oath. He offers them redemption, offers them release from their curse, offers them the chance to finally find peace and rest after centuries of this twilight existence. If only they will honor their oath at last, if only they will fight one final battle, if only they will serve the king as they should have served him so long ago when they were first called and first refused. The spirits are torn, caught between their resentment and their desire for release, between their hatred of the living and their desperate wish to be free of the curse that binds them. Their king, the king of the dead, manifests before Aragorn, a figure more substantial and more terrible than the others, clearly once a great warrior and leader in life, now reduced to this ghostly existence through his own failure and betrayal. He challenges Aragorn, questions his authority, denies that Isildur's line has any right to command them, claims that the line of kings failed and ended long ago. But Aragorn reveals Andúril, the sword that was reforged from the shards of Narsil, the sword that Isildur himself once wielded, the sword that cut the ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age. The sight of this sword, this ancient symbol of kingship and authority, proves Aragorn's claim beyond any possible doubt, demonstrates that he is indeed who he claims to be, that he does indeed have the right to hold them to their oath. The sword gleams with its own inner light, even in the darkness of the paths of the dead, shining like a star, like a beacon, like proof incarnate of Aragorn's royal lineage and his legitimate authority to command the spirits and to offer them the redemption they have sought for so long. The king of the dead and his army of spirits finally agree to honor their oath, to fight one final battle for the king of Gondor, to fulfill the promise they made and broke so many centuries ago. They will march with Aragorn to the defense of Gondor, will fight against Sauron's forces in the battle for Minas Tirith, and through this service they will finally earn their release from the curse, will finally be allowed to pass from the world into whatever afterlife awaits them, will finally find the peace and rest that they have been denied for all these long centuries of cursed existence in the shadows and darkness of the mountain halls. Meanwhile, the forces of Mordor are indeed gathering and beginning their march toward Minas Tirith, preparing to lay siege to the White City, preparing to destroy the last major stronghold of resistance against Sauron's dominion, preparing to eliminate Gondor once and for all, and thereby leave the rest of Middle-earth undefended and helpless before the Dark Lord's conquest. The armies that emerge from Mordor are vast and terrible, numbering in the tens of thousands, or perhaps even hundreds of thousands. A seemingly endless horde of orcs and trolls and evil men who serve Sauron willingly or through coercion, all marching under the banner of the Eye, all devoted to the destruction of everything good and free and beautiful in Middle-earth. Leading these armies are the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, the 9 servants of Sauron, who were once great kings of men, but who long ago accepted rings of power from Sauron and were thereby corrupted and enslaved, transformed into undead servants of absolute evil, existing now only to serve their master's will, having lost all independent thought and feeling and desire except for hatred and the compulsion to obey Sauron's commands. They ride not on horses now, but on fell beasts, terrible flying creatures that resemble enormous bats or dragons, but are neither, creatures of Mordor, creatures of nightmare, creatures that inspire terror in all who see them or hear their piercing shrieks echoing across the battlefield. The chief of the Nazgûl, the Witch King of Angmar, leads the assault on Minas Tirith. This is the most powerful and most terrible of all the ring wraiths. Once a great sorcerer king, now a being of pure malevolence and supernatural power, wielding a black mace that can shatter stone and a sword that can kill with a single touch, surrounded by an aura of fear and despair that weakens the hearts of all who face him in battle. It is said that no living man can kill the Witch King, that he is invulnerable to mortal weapons wielded by mortal men, and this prophecy has proven true through many battles and many centuries, giving him an aura of invincibility that makes him all the more terrifying to his enemies. The siege of Minas Tirith begins with the arrival of these vast armies before the walls surrounding the city, cutting it off from all outside aid and supply, beginning the systematic assault on the gates and walls that will continue day and night without cease until either the city falls or the attacking forces are themselves destroyed. The orcs bring siege towers, enormous wooden structures on wheels that can be rolled up to the walls to allow attackers to climb up and engage the defenders at close range. They bring great battering rams, massive tree trunks capped with iron shaped like wolf heads or dragon heads, swung by teams of orcs to hammer against the gates and walls with tremendous force, again and again and again, each impact shaking the stones, each blow testing the strength of ancient masonry, each strike bringing the walls that much closer to collapse. But most terrible of all are the catapults and trebuchets that launch projectiles into the city, not merely stones or burning materials as might be used in an ordinary siege, but the severed heads of Gondor's defenders who fell in earlier skirmishes and battles, the heads of men who died trying to slow the enemy's advance, now desecrated and weaponized, hurled into the city to land in the streets and courtyards, a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to break the spirits of the defenders, to make them understand the fate that awaits them if the city falls, to make them despair and lose the will to continue fighting. The defenders of Minas Tirith fight back with desperate courage, manning the walls in shifts that never end, shooting arrows and throwing spears at the attackers below, dropping stones and burning oil on those who attempt to scale the walls or approach the gates, fighting hand to hand with any enemies who manage to reach the top of the walls, defending their city with everything they have, with every ounce of strength and courage they can muster. But they are vastly outnumbered, and as the days of siege continue, as more and more defenders fall and are not replaced, as exhaustion and despair begin to take their toll, it becomes increasingly clear that the city cannot hold indefinitely, that eventually the walls will be breached, that eventually the enemy will force their way inside, that eventually Minas Tirith will fall unless aid comes from somewhere, unless some unexpected deliverance arrives to turn the tide of battle. Gandalf takes charge of the defense in the increasing absence of effective leadership from Denethor, who has withdrawn into himself, who spends his time brooding in the White Tower, who no longer issues coherent commands or makes rational decisions, who is effectively paralyzed by his despair and his conviction that defeat is inevitable. Gandalf rides through the streets on Shadowfax, rallying the defenders, organizing the resistance, making tactical decisions, inspiring the men to continue fighting despite the apparently hopeless odds, using his power and his presence to strengthen their hearts and their wills when despair threatens to overwhelm them completely. Pippin serves as a guard of the citadel, wearing the uniform of Gondor, standing watch in the White Tower, witnessing Denethor's descent into complete madness. Faramir leads a sortie out from the city to attempt to retake Osgiliath, an ancient city that stands on both sides of the Great River, a strategic position that has been captured by Mordor's forces and from which they can launch attacks on Minas Tirith's flanks and supply lines. But this sortie is doomed from the start, ordered by Denethor more out of madness and spite than out of any rational military strategy, seemingly designed more to punish Faramir, to prove him inadequate, to perhaps even get him killed so that Denethor will have no sons left, rather than having to live with the constant reminder that the wrong son survived. The sortie fails disastrously, with most of Faramir's men killed by overwhelming enemy forces, by orc archers, and by the Nazgul attacking from the air on their fell beasts. Faramir himself is struck by a poisoned arrow, a Morgul shaft that carries a deadly venom, and a spiritual corruption that causes terrible fever and delirium, bringing him close to death. He is brought back to the city unconscious and fevered, carried by his surviving men who manage to rescue him from the battlefield and bring him home despite the overwhelming odds against their survival. Denethor sees his son brought back, apparently dying, sees what he interprets as the fulfillment of his worst fears and darkest expectations, sees the loss of his last son, his last connection to the future, his last reason for hope or continued resistance. His madness finally takes complete control of his mind, completely overwhelms whatever sanity and reason still remained in him. He declares that all is lost, that the end has come, that there is no point in further resistance or further suffering. In his madness, he decides that he and Faramir should die together, should burn together on a funeral pyre, should escape through death from the horror and degradation of defeat and conquest that he is certain is about to befall the city. Pippin realizes what Denethor intends to do and runs to find Gandalf, desperately seeking help to prevent this madness, to save Faramir, who is not actually dead or even dying, but merely wounded and fevered and in need of healing rather than burning. Gandalf and Pippin race to the White Tower, to the hall where Denethor has already begun preparing the pyre, already laid Faramir upon it, already doused both Faramir and himself with oil, already holds the torch that will light the fire and consume them both. They arrive just as Denethor is about to light the pyre, just moments before Faramir would have been burned alive while unconscious and helpless, unable to defend himself or escape from his father's terminal madness. Gandalf intervenes with both physical force and the force of his presence and authority, stopping Denethor, rescuing Faramir from the pyre, carrying him to safety and to the houses of healing where he can receive proper care and treatment for his wounds and his fever. But Denethor cannot be saved from himself, cannot be pulled back from the brink of his final despair, cannot be prevented from carrying out his intention to die, to escape from the world through self-destruction. He lights himself on fire deliberately, choosing death by burning, choosing to end his life rather than face what he believes is inevitable defeat and degradation. He burns while still holding the Palantir, the seeing stone that contributed so greatly to his madness, clutching it even as the flames consume his body. And in his final moments, in his dying agony, he sees in the Palantir what he believes is confirmation of his despair, sees Sauron's forces apparently triumphing, sees what he interprets as the final victory of darkness over light, though, in fact, what he is seeing is distorted and incomplete, manipulated by Sauron to show only despair and defeat while hiding any signs of hope or possible salvation. Denethor dies. The steward of Gondor perishes in fire and madness, leaving the city without its traditional leader at the very moment when leadership is most desperately needed, leaving a power vacuum at the worst possible time, but also in a strange way, removing an obstacle, removing a source of defeatism and despair that was itself undermining the defense, removing someone whose madness was doing almost as much damage to Gondor's cause as the armies besieging the walls. The assault on Minas Tirith reaches its climax when the Great Gate, the main gate of the city, is finally breached by Grond, an enormous battering ram shaped like a wolf's head, wreathed in flame, wielded by 100 mountain trolls under the command of the Witch King himself. The gate, which has stood for thousands of years, which has never been breached or broken in all the long history of Gondor, finally shatters under the relentless pounding, the ancient wood splitting, the iron bands breaking, the whole massive structure collapsing inward, creating an opening through which the enemy can pour into the city itself. The Witch King rides through the broken gate on his fell beast, entering the first level of the city in triumph, believing that victory is now assured, that the city will fall within hours, that nothing can stop him now. Gandalf confronts him at the gate, the White Rider facing the Black Captain, wizard against ringwraith, light against darkness, good against evil in a confrontation that represents in microcosm the entire struggle for Middle-earth, the entire war between Sauron and the Free Peoples, the entire conflict between domination and freedom, between death and life, between darkness and light that has shaped the history of this age and will determine the shape of the age to come. They face each other in the gateway, neither willing to yield, neither able to advance past the other. Gandalf blocking the Witch King's path into the city, the Witch King unable or unwilling to simply destroy Gandalf and continue his advance. They exchange words, threats, and challenges. The Witch King reminding Gandalf of the ancient prophecy that no living man can kill him, mocking the wizard's attempt to stand against him, promising that his death is inevitable, that resistance is futile, that defeat and darkness are certain. But before this confrontation can be resolved in combat, before either can strike against the other, before the question of who would prevail in such a battle can be answered, the sound of horns echoes across the Pelennor fields, coming from the north, coming from an unexpected direction, announcing the arrival of allies, the arrival of aid that was hoped for but not certain, the arrival of forces that will change the entire character of the battle and shift the balance of power in ways that neither side fully anticipated. The Rohirrim have arrived. The riders of Rohan have come to Gondor's aid. 6,000 cavalry under the command of King Theoden have ridden through the night and arrived at dawn, just as the city was on the brink of falling, just as all seemed lost, just as despair was about to triumph completely over hope. They have come despite the great distance, despite the dangers of the road, despite their own kingdom's needs and problems, come because of their ancient alliance with Gondor, because of their friendship and mutual defense pact that has existed between Rohan and Gondor for many centuries, because Theoden has chosen honor and loyalty over caution and self-interest, chosen to ride to war even at great risk, because it is the right thing to do, because his allies need him, because the cause of freedom and light demands that all who can fight, must stand together, must resist the darkness with everything they have. The arrival of the Rohirrim transforms the battle instantly and dramatically. The siege of the city becomes a field battle, becomes a massive cavalry charge across the Pelennor fields, becomes 6,000 mounted warriors crashing into the flank of Mordor's army, which was focused entirely on the city and not at all prepared for an assault from an unexpected direction, from forces they did not know were approaching, from cavalry that strikes with devastating shock and impact, trampling orcs beneath their horses' hooves, riding down the enemy formations, breaking through their lines, creating chaos and destruction wherever they ride. Theoden himself leads the charge, riding at the very front of his forces, his sword raised high, his voice crying out the ancient battle cries of Rohan, inspiring his men to courage and fury, giving them the strength and will to smash into the enemy despite the overwhelming odds, despite the certainty of death for many of them, despite every rational consideration that should counsel caution or restraint. This is Theoden's finest hour, his moment of ultimate glory, the culmination of his life and his reign, the proof of his courage and his honor, the demonstration of everything that a king should be, everything that leadership means, everything that makes men willing to follow and to die for a cause greater than themselves. The charge is devastating and magnificent and terrible all at once, one of the great cavalry charges of all the ages of Middle-earth, perhaps the greatest cavalry charge in the history of warfare, 6,000 horsemen moving as one, a hammer blow of steel and horseflesh and courage crashing into an enemy that outnumbers them 20 to 1 or 30 to 1. But finding that courage and shock and the pure impact of their charge is enough to drive the enemy back, to break their formations, to create confusion and panic, to turn what seemed like certain victory for Mordor into sudden uncertainty and fear. But the triumph is short-lived and comes at terrible cost. The Witch King on his fell beast descends from the air directly onto Theoden, attacking the King of Rohan from above, striking down Snowmane, Theoden's beloved horse, causing both horse and rider to crash to the ground. Theoden is trapped beneath his dying horse, crushed and mortally wounded, unable to rise or defend himself, helpless before the Witch King, who approaches to deliver the killing blow, to end Theoden's life, to destroy the leader of the Rohirrim, and thereby hopefully break their charge and scatter their forces in confusion and grief. But Éowyn is there, having disguised herself as a man, having hidden among the riders of Rohan against her uncle's express command that she remain behind to lead the refugees and civilians to safety, having chosen to defy orders and tradition and everything expected of her, because she could not bear to remain behind while others rode to glory and battle and possible death. She interposes herself between the Witch King and her uncle, standing over Theoden protectively, refusing to yield, refusing to flee, facing down the most terrible enemy on the battlefield with nothing but a sword and her courage and her love for her uncle and her people. The Witch King mocks her, laughs at her presumption, reminds her and everyone within earshot of the ancient prophecy that no living man can kill him, believing himself invulnerable, believing that this prophecy makes him effectively immortal in battle. immune to any weapon wielded by any warrior of the race of men. But Eowyn removes her helmet, reveals herself as a woman, reveals that she is not a man at all, but a shield maiden of Rohan, and therefore the prophecy does not apply to her, does not protect the Witch King from her blade, does not make him invulnerable to her strike.